Oh, there we go. As we get set up, I would just want to remind folks that while it's great that everyone could come to Cleveland today and this week to participate in our annual Great Lakes Restoration Conference, I also want to make sure that you are invited to come to Washington, D.C. in the spring. The first week of March will be Great Lakes Days in Washington. Every year we bring folks to Washington so you can carry the message that you're hearing about and the information that you're learning about here today with you to talk to the decision makers that we need to be with us and make the decisions that we need them to make in order to be able to continue the success that we're having across the region. So that is the first week in March. More information will be sent out for you, and I hope to see you all in Washington, D.C. next year. As Jeff said, my name is Chad Lord. I am the Policy Director for the Healing Our Waters Coalition. I am joined by a distinguished panel of two at the moment. Our third panelist is in a cab from the airport as we speak. We will be talking to you about the train wreck, Fiscal cliff. There are a lot of other ways of putting what we could see happen this fall. Jeff talked a lot about our focus at this conference regarding the presidential candidates, but there is another institution in Washington that many of you are probably heard about, the United States Congress, that is also instrumental in making decisions that impact the Great Lakes. And so some of the things that we'll be talking about in this session today will not only help you hopefully prepare for the session on Thursday when we have surrogates from both campaigns here to talk to you about their candidates' platforms on the Great Lakes and other environmental issues, but also help you learn and understand what's going on. So when we come to you and ask for you to communicate with your members of Congress, you have some background on what's going on in Washington. I want to give credit for this presentation. It's not totally all mine. Some of it is based off of a presentation that a colleague of mine at MPCA gave, Craig Obie, our Vice President for Government Affairs. The sources for this also would be from the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, the many different federal budget reports and congressional budget justifications, and the Congressional Budget Office. So anyways, what are we going to talk about this morning? I'm going to provide the history. I'm going to provide an overview, kind of a review of what has happened over the last few years, just to set the stage for what our panelists will begin talking about, which will be a preview of what we might expect. We will hopefully be joined here shortly by Jonathan McCracken, who is the legislative assistant from the office of Senator Sherrod Brown, the senior senator from here, the great state of Ohio. Paul Isley, professor and chair of the economics department at Grand Valley State University, will walk us through an analysis and some perspective on what the presidential candidates are saying in terms of their budgets, just to give us a little bit of a sense as to how what they're talking about may impact the Great Lakes restoration funding. And then Emma White from Belden Rusinello Strategies is going to provide us with an overview of what you all are saying to our decision makers, what the public wants to see from them. So, a little bit on the background, and just a word of caution, I like charts, and so you're going to see a lot of them. I hope that's not the problem, because that's what you're going to see. Anyways, I find charts to be very helpful to me, and I hope they're helpful to you in terms of describing in very dramatic form what is going on. This is just a chart of funding over the last few years for Great Lakes restoration funding. As you can see, there was quite a big uptick in fiscal year 2010, which occurred a few years ago, 3 years ago to be exact. That uptick is mostly because of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. That was part of the budget, President Obama's first inaugural budget, when he requested $475 million for Great Lakes restoration funding. But I really want to focus on a couple of key points of Great Lakes restoration funding, because when we talk about funding, we can talk about a lot of different types of programs. There are many, many different programs that many of you work with on a daily basis that really have a positive impact throughout, on Great Lakes restoration at many of the different agencies. I just want to focus on the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, because that has been the top priority for our coalition and what we have been working with you on for the last few years. And like I said, that jump in funding is the consequence of the GLRI. So this is what that looks like over time. Starting in fiscal year 2010, which was, I guess, 2009, 2010, we had $475 million not only requested by President Obama, but also appropriated or funded by the United States Congress. In 2011, fiscal year 2011, that dropped down to $300 million, and that's kind of where we've been at for the last few years. I note the middle bar just because that was what was originally proposed for the fiscal 2012 budget 2 years ago in the U.S. House of Representatives. They wanted $250 million, which was a $50 million decrease over what the president had proposed. And what was significant about that was that Steve LaTourette, who is a retiring congressman from the northeast part of Ohio, a Republican, offered an amendment on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives to boost that back up to the president's request. I always like to tell this story because it is a very dramatic reminder to me as someone who works in Washington, and I hope will be reassuring to you who may just hear a bunch of arguing going on in Washington, D.C., that there is still bipartisan cooperation on a few key issues. The funding increase for the Great Lakes Restoration Program, as far as I can tell, was the only funding increase for any program in any federal agency for that particular fiscal year. And it was passed by a bipartisan majority in the U.S. House of Representatives in a very fiscally conservative political body. So I think that is very dramatic evidence of the kind of support that we're seeing. As we're going to be talking about throughout these presentations and throughout the conference, there's going to be some significant challenges to carry through that bipartisan spirit in order to make sure that we maintain that funding level at, kind of that flat line at $300 million, where we're seeing it kind of settle at for the last few years. So this is what's going on this year. Last year was $300 million. The president requested an additional $300 million in his budget request earlier this year. And again, the U.S. House of Representatives introduced legislation to cut that back to $250 million. So we don't know where this is going to end up because the appropriations measures have yet to pass. But anyways, I just wanted to provide you with kind of a status report of where we're at. We don't know what the Senate is going to request because they haven't introduced any legislation at this point. A lot of this is going to get wrapped up in the discussions around the appropriations bills at the end of the year, the sequestration, all of that. It's a pretty murky cloud or pretty cloudy. It's pretty cloudy right now, and we can't really predict how this is going to play itself out. But this is the current status. Already noted by the speaker before me and others is that sewage infrastructure is a key component to whether or not we're going to be successful in restoring the Great Lakes. Well, this is just the chart that describes funding for the state revolving funds, both the drinking water and the clean water state revolving fund. And here is where we're at in terms of the current cycle. In fiscal year 2012, we saw about 1.5 billion dollars proposed for sewage infrastructure. That dropped down in the request from the president quite significantly, and then this year the House cut that back even more to $689 million. If you go back to this chart, that $689 million is kind of around the very bottom of that red line. And that's where we ended up at the end of the last administration. I offer this chart just because it's about Asian carp, and I know it's a concern and needs to be a concern for us all. We're not going to talk a lot about Asian carp on this panel just because we have a really exciting panel tomorrow morning of people who will be getting into that in more specifics, but I just wanted to show you kind of the funding patterns just so you had that background. Anyways, so that's where we've been at. That has been the history. That has been a little bit of a review of things. Where are we at right now, today, September 11, 2012? Well, the Congress has yet to get to any sort of agreement on funding for Great Lakes restoration. And so they need to pass what is known as a continuing resolution in order to keep the government funded. Well, they've come to an agreement. That legislation has been introduced, and as this slide shows you, that spending deal vote could come as early as this Thursday. It just basically punts the ball until after the election next year. And as one of our speakers, Jonathan McCracken, will talk about, that is one of the many, many things that Congress will have to deal with when they come back after the election. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the Budget Control Act. The Budget Control Act for folks is the debt deal from last summer. You probably all remember, or maybe you don't, I don't know. Maybe in Washington we get a very skewed perspective of what happens because our TV just talks all constantly about politics. It's probably different outside of it is different outside the Beltway. Budget control. This was the debt deal, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about it so people understood it because it's going to have a direct impact on Great Lakes funding. The debt deal imposed really tight funding caps on the U.S. federal budget. And those funding caps decrease over the next 10 years for about $900 billion in total savings over the next 10 years. You also probably remember all the discussion around the super committee. Well, the debt deal also created the super committee, which was supposed to come up with another $1.2 trillion worth of savings, whether or not funding cuts, tax increases, savings with the entitlement programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, they were unsuccessful. So what does that mean? Well, it means that there will be automatic cuts of $1.2 trillion that will take place coming January 2nd, 2013. It's estimated that it will be, and these cuts in January are going to be on top of what was already agreed to in terms of the cap. So you had $900 million cut right away. That's already baked into the federal budget. And so we're now looking at across-the-board cuts of $1.2 trillion coming in the new year. In 2013 alone, these automatic cuts are going to require around 9-10% of cut in defense accounts. So this would be the military, about a 2% cut in Medicare, and a 9% cut in everything else, including Great Lakes restoration programs. What's interesting to think about, however, is that Congress can do whatever they want with that legislation, and so these bars just will show you is that, you have the existing caps, the $900 million cuts in blue, the red, the middle bar is the caps plus the sequester. So in January, the funding cut drops significantly, and then the green bar represents the House budget that passed earlier this year in the U.S. House of Representatives. So what happens if the Congress wants to protect defense, which a lot of people are talking about being a priority? Well, the cuts have to come from somewhere. And so as you can see, if defense is protected, which it is in the House budget, the cuts have to be even deeper in the other bars, which are on the other side, the non-defense discretionary spending, which is where the Great Lakes budget resides. So if defense gets protected, greater cuts elsewhere. It's zero sum. As I think President Clinton said last week, it's about math. This is strictly arithmetic. The money has to come from somewhere, so those are the decisions that our leaders are faced with. Both parties say they want to avoid these cuts. Great. Republicans have generally said they want to avoid the defense cuts. Democrats have said they want to avoid the non-defense cuts. The president said he will veto any bill to repeal any of the cuts unless they are replaced with some sort of balanced approach. So we'll see how this gets played out over the next few months. Because of the pre-election gridlock, however, nothing's going to happen before the election. So everything that we're talking about and everything that you'll hear about that needs to be discussed and Jonathan will talk about this fall is going to need to take place between November 6th and December 31st. A very compressed window for action. And you'll see later on in the presentations that that there's a lot of things for them to do. So, our speakers, and I see Jonathan just joined us. We'll give him a chance to settle down first, and I think we'll go to Paul next. But after the elections, the perfect storm, the train wreck, the fiscal cliff. Jonathan McCracken, who I said was a legislative assistant with Senator Sherrod Brown, will offer his perspectives on what to expect in the United States Congress. Jonathan's issue portfolio covers transportation, energy, and the environment. We're glad that he can be here with us today in Cleveland. Next up, how will the numbers add up in the candidates' budgets? Dr. Paul Isley will provide some perspective on that. Dr. Isley is a professor and currently chair of the Economics Department in the Seidman College of Business at Grand Valley State University. Before joining the Grand Valley State University faculty in 1995, and after earning his PhD in economics he joined the Grand Valley State University after earning his PhD in economics from Purdue University. He's published numbers of studies and reports, just recently completed work on reports evaluating wind power along the lakeshore and valuing environmental cleanup in Muskegon Lake, and I know he has a little bit of a talk, not based on necessarily this particular research, but on the issues around Muskegon and the economic value there later on in the conference, I think on Thursday. So as I already discussed, he'll provide his perspectives on the presidential budgets. And then Emma White, who is the Senior Director at Belden Rusinello Strategists, and we'll talk about the public opinion. She has conducted quite a bit of public opinion, not only for the coalition, but also others, and that research has and developed messages for clients on numerous issues, including education, civil rights, and immigration. Her work on environmental topics has covered energy, mining, air and water pollution, oceans, toxic chemicals. She's been working with the coalition since 2005 to help us understand how the region feels about protecting the Great Lakes and develop the strongest messages to support our work. And as Jeff noted already, many of you have been through our message trainings. Many of the messages you see on our material, hear us talk about, the longer we wait, the more expensive and difficult it becomes. Those messages were developed and came from Ms. White's research. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to, well, Jonathan, are you prepared? Why don't we just go along the order that we had already originally talked about. And you're welcome to sit at the table or come up to the podium. I will just load up a quick here. And Jonathan will walk us through this fall.
Sure. Great. Well, thanks for having me, everybody. And normally when I see many of you, I think I'm either talking about sea lamprey or Asian carp. So today I'm going to put on my budget hat and see what I can do here and kind of walk you through some of the issues going on in D.C., whether it's the much discussed fiscal cliff or whether it's sequestration, which is part of the fiscal cliff, whether it's the Budget Control Act, whether it's the continuing resolution, all those sorts of fun things that are so important for so many of the funding issues we all care about, whether it's the revolving loan fund for wastewater infrastructure, whether it's obviously the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, or whether it's conservation programs run out of NRCS. I guess I'll kind of just set the stage here. In recent years, as many of us know, the funding for key programs of importance to this community, GLRI, SRF, drinking water, clean water, has been flat or slightly decreased. I think maybe Chad showed that slide earlier. And it appears with the current trend in Washington, where there seems to be broad consensus that there is a clear need to tame deficits and balance that with job creation and economic growth. And it seems the number that has been really kicked around on both sides of the aisle, both sides of the Capitol, is around $3 trillion in deficit reduction over the next 10 years, which sounds like quite a bit, and it is quite a bit. The first step that Congress took on this was last summer, which was the fund, you all may recall, on the deficit ceiling, raising the debt ceiling rather. And this went down to the wire. And out of raising the debt ceiling came what was called the Budget Control Act. And the Budget Control Act said we're going to cut $1 trillion over the next 10 years by placing caps on statutory caps on spending. So we kind of already have a guideline for discretionary spending over the next 10 years out till FY 2011 or 2021, I believe. And then the second part of that was the creation of the Super Committee, which is a task to find additional $1.2 trillion in cuts over 10 years. Obviously, that didn't happen. There was, kind of this balance of whether it was revenue or whether it was additional spending decreases, and so that hit this trigger called sequestration, which was we get into FY13 and we have across the board cuts in both defense spending and non-defense discretionary spending, which includes some mandatory spending as well. Some programs are exempt, the SNAP program, school lunch program, some others, and some programs are capped at what they can be cut. For instance, Medicare is capped at 2% of the total. It needs to be capped. But so what this means is this is additional, if this is not, additional $1.2 trillion is not found by January 3rd, 2013, an additional $109 billion needs to be cut from next year's budget and for each of the budgets for the following 9 fiscal years. And that's addition to the cap we already have in place. So this equates to about an 8.4% across the board reduction across all programs. So that means GLRI, that means programs at USDA, so that perhaps means fewer extension agents helping farmers or livestock owners out. And I think one of the agriculture panels will talk in much greater detail about that later. It means less money going to SRF, which is particularly important here in Ohio as it relates to combined sewage overflows and water quality in the lake and in the watershed. So there are some big decisions here. And this falls into the next part of this fiscal cliff, which we kind of have this, everything's happened all at once this year. The Bush tax cuts, as commonly referred to, expire at the beginning of the year. The doc fix, which relates to spending on Medicare, that also expires. The alternative minimum tax expires. The temporary Social Security tax cut expires. We have the sequestration. So you have all these things, kind of this storm converging here. And the Congressional Budget Office has done a number of studies on this, and they say if you just let everything expire, all the spending cuts take place, you're looking at tremendous short-term pain. Actually, they project in their most recent projection in August, they projected negative growth next year, increase in unemployment rate. But if you were to extend everything, we don't really answer the deficit issue at all. So this obviously is the big challenge for Congress in the next several months. It appears that before the election, this will not be addressed. A 6-month CR will be passed. The House will pass it this week. The Senate will either take it up later this week or go ahead and pass it next week. So I think, so you have these huge challenges, and do we answer them in the lame duck? I think that is a great question, and I think we'll maybe hear a little more later about what the trends are. I think there's all sorts of different scenarios for how things play out. But I think it's important to remember, I think, out of the gate, that we've already reduced discretionary spending by about $1 trillion, and that is equated to a budget for the next 10 years in these discretionary caps. And that, like I said, that goes through FY21. There was an intent by Congress with the super committee, and there's been several other committees throughout Washington and different plans, whether it's the Simpson-Bowles plan or that's the Domenici-Rivlin plan. There's all sorts of different plans out there. And again, that is focused around this $3 trillion number. But I think one of the other takeaways in talking to different folks on Capitol Hill, on both sides of the aisle, is that no one likes sequestration, whether you don't like cuts to discretionary programs or whether you don't like cuts to defense spending, which is the other part of the sequestration. It's split 50-50, about $54.2 billion on the non-discretionary side and on the defense side for each of the next several years. So it's the idea of sequestration is really ugly and rough. It is not clean. It's really more of a cleaver when a scalpel would be better, to kind of use that cliche. It's truly unclear how it's going to be implemented, and I believe next week OMB will be sending up to the Hill how they think the sequestration can happen, what it means for agencies, and how it would be implemented. So that's something that I think a lot of people will be really looking forward to, and that was something that Congress requested of OMB. But I think the takeaway is, unless Congress acts, these across-the-board cuts will occur. But again, there is a clear sense that deficits our current deficits are unsustainable, and there's a need to address it. So I guess, what does that mean for the programs we care about? As I said, GLRI, SRF, USGS, research funding, whether it's tax credits, like the extenders also expire this year, and there's lots of really important business incentives and business tax credits that folks like, whether it's the research and development tax credit, whether it's the production tax credit for wind. There's a whole host of credits out there that a lot of folks really think are provide a boost to the economy. But I think, so we don't know how this works itself out yet. But from my boss's perspective, there's a clear need for a balanced approach to deficit reduction. And absent a balanced approach, there will be a tremendous amount of pressure, I think, on Congress and members of Congress that these cuts will come from the non-defense side of discretionary spending. And I think there are a couple reasons for this. First, there's clear bipartisan agreement that Medicare and Social Security should not be cut for existing beneficiaries or those near retirement. And also that those that are opposed to the current proposed level of defense cuts, which is, I said, about $55 billion per year over the next 10 years or so, they believe these cuts should go much further than shouldn't go as far to get us to this magic $3 trillion number. So we have, as we often kind of maybe paint ourselves into a corner in Washington, we have these tremendous challenges. I mean, I really think that there will hopefully in some way be a balance of revenue issue as certain longstanding credits expired. And I think that Congress will adopt the pay-go approach, where if you produce increased spending, you have to cut spending someplace else. The current tax credits didn't operate under pay-go over this 10-year budget window. So I think that's something that is clear, that both the House and the Senate have decided that pay-go will come back as we address these big issues of whether it's tax reform or entitlement reform or any number of things. But I think at the end of the day, both sides are really looking for economic growth, but how you get there is the devil's always in the details. So that's the kind of the short background on what's going on in Washington. So I think really a lot, maybe as we hear more from the pollsters, we can have a better idea of what's going to happen after November, or from the candidates later this week, about how they would fix this.
Thanks, Jonathan. And just to show you pictorially, oops, you could put up the quicks.
So what's this?
Maybe not. Anyways, I was going to show you the list of things Jonathan was talking about, just so you could get a sense of how overwhelming it feels, at least to people who work in Washington and probably those of the work on Capitol Hill. Next, Paul Isley will talk to us about a little more about the budgets, but this time focusing on the candidate budget proposals.
And since you didn't hear that, I came over here so that I can actually push the buttons and move the computer going forward. All right, so maybe. Oop, too fast though. I'm clicking it down here, but not up there. There we go. All right, so there's several things that we have to deal with here. It was my job to look at the two candidates and look or try and get a feel about their budgets. This is relatively tricky because during a election year, candidates tend not to give the specifics that an economist needs. So I'm going to start out with a little bit more of a higher level thought process here to give you an idea where it's coming from that will allow me to then build where I think things are heading. All right? Realize that this is the candidate's wish. And as we've just heard, their wishes might not be what happens in the end. All right? So, I'm an economist, so I have to throw up a graph. I think I actually have fewer graphs than Chad, and that could be a record for an economist to have fewer charts than someone else. But nonetheless, I want to just give you this basic concept here that the economy is growing over time, and since World War II, it's grown at about 3.1% in real terms. All right, and then it varies around it, and we have recessions and boom times. And if you didn't know that, my students didn't know that until we hit 2007, 2008, and then they discovered what a recession was. How the two parties react to this is completely different. All right, and therefore, how these candidates are going to then move it through their budget is different. All right. So this is a highly stylistic, simplified version of how a Republican thinks. All right? And what we see is that they aren't as worried about how the economy is moving up and down, but they are worried about the growth rate of the economy. So you'll constantly hear them talk about issues such as we can't do that because it's going to stymie growth, or we're going to have a problem with the deficit because it's going to slow down the economy. The thought process is that if we cause growth to increase enough, the variations in the economy won't matter because our base will be higher than the bad times were before. All right? It has an indirect ability to help out on that cycle because our baseline's now higher. All right? When it comes to Great Lakes funding, what this tells us is that Great Lakes funding and environmental funding really matters from this point of view when it has something that will improve the growth of the economy. All right? So if you're creating a system where people are better off, where people are better able to do business, where people want to do things, then it's going to create growth and it makes sense to do it. So if you look through the Republican planks, that's what they talk about. All right? All right, here's my stylized, really simplified version of how a Democrat thinks. All right? So here, they aren't as focused on growth. They're really focused on we want to make sure the bad times aren't as bad, and we're going to use some government procedures to help deal with that. All right? Now realize I'm being highly stylized here, but we don't have 5 hours for me to teach you macroeconomics. And you probably all leave before I was done anyways. All right? So in this particular case, now what we're seeing is a belief structure that government can cause good things to happen. And in these particular places, now we're seeing a thought process towards a more national environmental policy. And that's what we're seeing in the Democratic planks, where they talk explicitly about the Great Lakes and they talk explicitly about restoration processes. Now, these two things are going to lead to different ways to attack the budget. All right? So, how do they affect discretionary budgets? Well, if we look at Obama's current budget, and for lack of a better proxy, Ryan's current plan, Paul Ryan and Barack Obama's plans, we can see that the total base for discretionary funding is different. And this is based on that worry about growth, because deficits lead to problems with growth in the future. All right, so we got to bring down the total amount of the pile. All right, both of them reduce, so it's all there. They're both reducing from current baseline. They're both moving towards a more sustainable economy. All right, but one's doing so faster. But there's also a change in the mix, and as we heard earlier, a change in the mix from defense to defense means from the other parts of the discretionary budget. All right? That's assuming that we're not going to touch Social Security and Medicare, which we've just heard is unlikely. All right? So, if we see this and we look over the next 10 years, we can see that they are almost mirror images of each other on defense versus non-defense discretionary spending. All right? So we can see that the Ryan budget does 55% towards defense, and the Obama budget does 48%. And so this tells us that there's even a smaller pile for those discretionary pieces, which include the things that we're worried about. All right. So a nice blank page, which is a problem, but that's fine. So what does that mean? I'm an economist, and I'm going to now say I'm going to guess. All right? Now remember, economists often predict, and everybody knows they're guessing. I'm starting here with a guess because no one's told me exactly what they're going to do. But we do know a couple of things. We do know that the proposed ratio of defense to non-defense spending in the Ryan budget is consistent with what has been talked about by the Romney administration. All right. We also know that the Republican planks and the speeches by the candidates on the Republican side have said that they want to reduce spending to 20% of GDP. All right. That's down a little bit from where we are right now. And we also know that at least at some level in the past, even though we haven't heard as much more recently, there's a lot of backing for the GLRI funding. All right? And so what I come up with when I assume all of those things and then put in proportional cuts, because I can't tell you where you're going to cut, it comes down to around 67 to 127 million less for Great Lakes funding. You remember we had about 600 to 700 million from the graph that you saw earlier. All right? That's about 60 to 130 fewer restoration projects based on the average restoration project that we've seen across the Great Lakes region over the last 5 years. All right? So that's a big deal, and it's going to really make a difference as to how we're approaching the problem of the deficit versus wanting to maintain a decent environment. I want to put in a couple quick caveats, however. You need to pay really close attention as to how the candidates are going to talk about the fiscal cliff coming up. All right? The fiscal cliff is going to wash out their wish list, number one, and it's going to do so for a couple of reasons. It will most likely lead to a recession next year if it's allowed to occur the way it's going on. That recession will lead to less tax dollars. It will lead to less tax dollars at the state level as well as at the federal level. It will lead to higher interest rates in the United States because it will probably result in a change in our credit rating. It will change the value of the dollar and probably lead to inflation. So the number one thing you should be watching for is what are they going to do to solve the fiscal cliff? And unfortunately, the executive side can't do that. So there's the president.
Great, thanks, Paul. And now Emma will walk us through what the public is saying they would like to see.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today. As Chad said earlier, my job is to show you that the cuts that are being threatened, that everyone else has told us so much about, is not what the public wants, and that this is a bipartisan and broadly held view of support for the Great Lakes funding. I also want to take a pause and do a little bit of a long view at where we are as well. We have a lot of threats coming up. When I started this work with you all in 2005, there was no Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And I was out there asking the public in focus groups and in surveys, hey, what would you think if the federal government decided to spend this money on protecting the Great Lakes? And you won. You got a large appropriation of money to be able to do this. And you know, even the context that we're talking about now, it's not going to go away entirely. The projections that they've just shared for you. And so it can be kind of grim out there to looking at these issues. And I just want to make sure that we keep in mind the progress that we've made as well. So I'm just going to run through a few. We've done, as I said, we've been working with you on these issues since 2002, actually, and I've been working with you since 2005. And so we have a lot of data. I'm just going to walk through a few numbers right now to show you where the public's at on the big questions of restoration. So the numbers in here come from 2 studies that we did. One of them is a regional study, so that includes Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and parts of New York and Pennsylvania. The other one is Ohio specific, and that was of voters in Ohio that we did earlier this year. And you'll see in the next few slides that both of these get you very positive results. So the key takeaways here, you've got broad support and bipartisan support for continuing the Great Lakes funding without cutting it. You've got, when you talk specifically about what the restoration funding is doing, you have wide support for thinking those are good ways to spend federal tax dollars. We've got in this fight that we're in, this balance that people are making and the talk about the deficit, you'll see the deficit is not as important to the voters in this context, that it's not a reason to cut the funding. You know, it is something that folks care about, but when you get specific with what you're doing in the Great Lakes, they're not willing to cut it to reduce the deficit. And you even see, and this should be important for some of you in the room, I think, that a Congress who votes against funding faces some negative reaction from constituents in the region. So this is from the regional study, and this has 75% support for continuing the Great Lakes funding, and this was asked a little earlier, so it was at $400 million a year. We asked about the government spending this money to improve the Great Lakes by cleaning up toxic waste and bacteria, protecting and rebuilding wetlands, and preventing and managing invasive species. And you have a majority, 52%, strongly supports continuing that funding rather than reducing it. You've only got a quarter of the public on the other side, and you can see the little D and R and I there. Those are the reaction by party. There's not a huge difference among those bipartisan differences. 79% of Democrats, 70% of Republicans, 75% of independents across the region favor continuing the funding as is rather than reducing it. In Ohio, the graph changed color, but the numbers didn't really move. You get, we asked a very similar question, we got very similar results. You see a little more difference between Democrats and Republicans here, but you still see 63% among Republicans favor continuing the funding. 79% of Democrats, 72% of independents. In Ohio, we wanted to see, because we know that this is what's coming up, we wanted to present as hard a case as we could about the need to have other priorities beyond protecting the Great Lakes. So one side of this question was the government should focus on creating jobs and reducing the federal budget deficit. And the Great Lakes should take a budget cut along with everything else. So instead of the idea of cutting Great Lakes spending in a vacuum, it's putting it in the context of everything else being cut as well. And then the other side says the government should maintain spending to keep the Great Lakes healthy and protect the health of the millions of people who rely on them for drinking water. And you've got a majority says that we should maintain spending and not cut it along with everything else, not cut it at all. Again, this is from the regional poll, and this is some of the examples of the good work that's been done in cleaning up the Great Lakes. And these are so popular with the public. And I'm sure you know all this, but you probably don't spend as much time looking at the polling data as I do. But our country is more and more divided. And even on environmental issues, we saw a Pew survey released earlier this year showed that the difference between Republicans and Democrats on environmental protection, the gap has grown by 20 points over the last decade. And this is that rare issue where we do not see that difference. So you have broad support for all three examples that we presented of what you've been working on. Cleaning up PCBs so that to make the river safe for fishing and swimming. Fixing the sewers to keep sewage waste out of Lake Superior. Restoring the Detroit River wetlands so that the fish can come back. And you have 3/4 to 8 and 10 saying each of these is excellent or good uses of money. And one of the reasons we know from the research that we've done that this gets such high numbers is that this is results. This isn't just goals. This isn't just hopes of what you can accomplish, that you're able to show here, we did these things, we cleaned up the PCBs, and it worked. It's safe to swim and fish there now. We fixed the wetlands around the Detroit River, and the fish have come back. So you've got real concrete examples that you can show people of the government using this money in ways that have made a difference in the habitat and in people's lives. So I didn't put the numbers on the slide, but again, these are bipartisan support for each of these issues. You have 86% of Democrats, 87% of Republicans, and 86% of independents saying that the cleaning up the PCBs from the Oswego River was an excellent or good use of tax dollars. You have 84% of Democrats, 83% of Republicans, and 84% of independents saying that fixing the sewers in Duluth was an excellent or good use of federal tax dollars. So you have near unanimous agreement that this is a positive way to spend the money. And if you are out there telling the story of what these dollars are doing, you have the opportunity to get a lot of support from the public. This slide picks out a couple of the statements that we presented folks with in the study that we did regionally to say, what are the arguments against funding that have resonance with the public? What are the arguments for funding that have resonance with the public? And you can see, just wanted to highlight these, the federal budget deficit causing us to need to cut federal government spending across the board, including for the Great Lakes, has 14% of people who rated that a 10, saying it was very persuasive, a 10 on a 1 to 10 scale. And even among Republicans, that was only 18%. In contrast, the statement that because the Great Lakes are the source of drinking water for 30 million people, we should protect them and protect the health of the people who live in this region, gets 52% rating it a 10 out of 10, is saying it's very persuasive. You've got examples of the work you've been doing that resonate with the public. You've got messages in support of the work that resonate with the public. And again, this is true bipartisanly. So you've got, I told you only 18% of Republicans said that the deficit argument listed there was a very persuasive reason. 47% of Republicans said the Great Lakes is a source of drinking water for 30 million people was very persuasive, along with 52% of independents and 58% of Democrats. And one of the questions we always ask when we're doing research is how important is this to people? There's a lot of issues that people are asked to pay attention to. There's a lot going on. And you can have an issue that people agree with and don't feel strongly, and it's not going to make much of a difference in how they approach things like voting. The question we asked here was to gauge how important this is to people, how they would react if their member of Congress voted to cut funding for Great Lakes restoration. And you can see that out of the total, 44% say they'd be less likely to support that member of Congress. It rises for some subgroups, particularly and interestingly, independent men. So 55% of independent men say that they'd be less likely to support a member of Congress who cut funding for Great Lakes restoration. The Great Lakes are that rare environmental issue where you've got stronger support among men than among women. And here you've got just particularly strong support among independent men. And this is true in the Ohio research as well. You've got strong support among independents, strong support among men. So that's the end of my slides, and I think at this point, I'm supposed to turn it over to Chad for some wrap up before we'll have a chance to answer some questions.
Thanks, Emma.
Yep.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists, Paul, Jonathan, Emma, for very interesting presentations. I hope that it has provided you with a lot of information. I know it's provided you with a lot of information, probably too much information, but we're giving you a couple of days to process all of this and hopefully give you a couple of days to think about what this information means. So when you hear the surrogates from each of the two campaigns who are going to be here Thursday morning, you will be able to ask them some tough questions about how they're going to protect the Great Lakes, whether or not that's going to be another Obama administration or whether or not that's going to be a new Romney administration. What are they going to do to continue the success, the results that Emma pointed to, the things that we know that we're doing in the region that are having a direct impact, the projects that we're doing in places in Ohio and in Michigan, Pennsylvania, New York, Minnesota, Illinois, or Indiana, that are bringing fish back to places that haven't been there before, or restoring areas of concern and moving them towards actual delisting, actually ticking them off the list after 30 or so years of having them sit there as being dirty places. But now being reborn as clean places that people want to invest in. So hopefully this will spark your imagination, spark your questions. Come to the Thursday morning panel. We've got a couple of surrogates who are coming. I think we announced it today in a press release, so I don't think it's a secret, but Carol M. Browner, the former administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency and a former advisor to President Obama on climate change and energy, will be representing the Obama campaign, and we're still waiting to hear from the Romney campaign on who their surrogate's going to be. We look forward to hearing about that this afternoon. So that is, so I didn't want you all to leave here totally depressed and thinking that, the dark clouds that are building over Washington, I don't want them to spill out of the Beltway and cover up the great work that's going on in the region. There's no reason for it. That's what we pay our politicians in Washington to do, which is to make these decisions, but it's our job to make sure that they understand what the consequences of those decisions are going to be. So I hope you can walk away from today's presentations with the information where you can understand that, make your own decisions, and ask some really tough questions. With that, I see we have 23 minutes and 17 seconds, according to the clock that's in front of us, to ask questions. So there are 2 microphones in the audience. If you have a question, just come up to the, and then if you could please, I can't really see people, so if you could just go from side to side, and I will leave it up to you to make that happen. I have no doubt we can have a very engaging question and answer session. So please say who you're directing the question to, whether or not it's a specific panelist or all of us. And let's take the next 22 minutes and see what you have to say.
Chad, Jill Crafton from Minnesota. Had an occasion to hear Senator Franken just a couple days ago addressing the issue of government creating jobs. So he brought up things like interstate highway, going to the moon, putting up satellites, and how that's generated jobs. My question specifically is, we keep hearing things like the Muskegon project, which is having 6-to-1 return on investment in terms of public health and stuff. Are we compiling information so that when we try to make the case with our legislative people that government funding does have really positive impacts for public health and whatever, is there a place to go to get more of that information?
Well, the short answer is yes, and I would direct you to the success stories reports that the coalition has produced that outline in kind of case study form various projects that have been supported through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and other restoration funding that clearly demonstrate that when you invest in restoring a wetland or deconstructing a dam or pulling toxic sediments out of a harbor, regardless if it's Muskegon or any of the other areas of concern, that you're going to see what the results are, whether or not that's fish returning to a stretch of river, or whether or not if that's waterfowl, ducks that are showing up in places where they haven't been seen in decades. Those are being that information is being collected, and it's available at the healthylakes.org website. So I would definitely direct you to that. We also have plans on continuing our focus on looking at the economics of restoration and what cuts might mean. So that is something to look forward to in the future.
Okay, I just wondered if there was like an economic study someplace that we could point to. If
Just-
Dr. Isley would have any information on something like that.
Well, there's many economic studies on restoration or changes in the Great Lakes. I thank you for quoting my stuff. You know, I have a list of them in my brain, and I don't want to just sort of rattle them off. But certainly, you can go to any academic database and put in this information, and you're going to get several economic articles out of it that go through the benefits that they're seeing.
Okay. Thank you.
In the back.
In a way, my question is similar, but I'm looking at the message that we give to public officials. I was surprised to hear that Emma had such high percentages of support for names of projects, which some people might find a little technical and difficult to understand. I guess I'm wondering whether you think that those pieces of information are going to be helpful in talking to legislators, and I certainly want to know if they are available on the web. And when I say pieces of information, I'm talking about the numbers, percentages of support in various groups, which I would think would be an influence to legislators. The other question is, you know, do you have any phraseology that you think is superior? I certainly reacted when you said protecting the Great Lakes versus Great Lakes restoration, for instance.
Okay, there's several questions in there. And one of them as to what of this data that I presented today is available. I believe that these presentations are all being made available through the conference, but you will have to talk to somebody here for that. It's really theirs to share. The Ohio specific results were publicly released, and I could get you that as well. The question about whether these descriptions of projects were too technical or how to describe them. We went through some focus groups where we listened to people over many years, and we were careful in the survey that we did to present them in a very non-technical way. So we talked about cleaning up contaminated sediment. We used specific names of chemicals because that's really helpful for people, even if they don't know what they are, to have a sense that you're talking about something concrete. Pollution can sound pretty vague. It's harder to hold on to. And if you say you're talking about PCB pollution, even if they don't have no clue what PCB is, then it's easier for people. And then to leave, the really important thing that all of those programs that we presented did was show the impact. And so they end with, so that people can swim and fish, so that fish have come back, so that we prevent millions of gallons of sewage from entering the lakes every year. And those are, the impact is always what the public is looking for. You know, advocates and the conversations that we get in with lawmakers, there's a lot of interest in process. And the public mostly is not that interested. They want to know what's going to be the outcome. And so I would say from a communications perspective that the most important thing you all can do to drum up support for this and to win support among the public is to just let people know in basic terms what this is accomplishing and that it's under threat.
And you are then suggesting that we communicate more with the public to build their support than narrowing ourselves down to directly talking with members of Congress.
Well, you obviously have to talk to the members of Congress too, but you have opportunity. And the campaign strategy, I'm going to leave to others who are more directly involved, but you have a great deal of opportunity to excite and engage the public on this topic. You know, one of the things that wasn't in my introduction is that I'm a native Michigander, and you know, I know how much the Great Lakes mean to people in this region. They're really important to people. You don't have to limit yourselves in your conversation to Congress. And For a message question, often we find that the best messages for the public is the most effective with congresspeople as well. You know, you've seen bipartisan support among the congressional delegation among this region because people on both sides of the aisle know that this issue is important to their constituents, and something that I'm sure with your work you can continue to see in the future.
I would just note that the presentations will be posted online, so everything you've seen today will be available on the internet. If you're interested in the Ohio polling, it was publicly released and is also available at healthylakes.org, including a very interesting infographic that pictorially describes the results that I would encourage all of you to use. That infographic was actually printed in the Cleveland Plain Dealer about a couple of months ago. We were very proud to see that work going into and getting that public message out. So just that's where you can access that information. I did want to see if, Jonathan, you had any advice in terms of what you are working in Washington on Capitol Hill, if there was anything that you thought that advocates here in the audience could say to your colleagues on Capitol Hill that would be particularly effective.
Sure. Well, I think, there has been pretty broad support for the initiative on both sides, both in the House and the Senate, across party lines. Congressman LaTourrette's been a particular champion in the House, Senator Voinovich when he was still serving in the Senate. But I think this Congress, we've seen a little bit of a break in the solid block of support of the Great Lakes senators, at least. In the past, I think we had, traditionally a letter goes from the Senate, I think probably the House as well, to the president as they're setting their budget, saying, we think this is a tremendous priority for our region, whether it's for public safety, whether it's for on drinking water side, whether it's in the recreational benefits, whether it's the huge economic benefits to what the lake means to Ohio and the tourism, to Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota and the others. I think it's really great to have this solid block. If we could get all 16 senators on board, that really shows this is a regional priority. Now there are some there's some reasons folks don't sign on, office policies, that sort of thing. But to really advocate, I think, as Emma was saying, to hear from constituents that this really does matter. This really is as important in Madison as it is in Cleveland is really helpful. And I think that folks really have the confidence to know that their constituents really support this program and it really makes a difference in their communities. And I certainly encourage you all to continue to talk to your senators or congressmen just to let them know all the great things GLRI has done. As Chad was saying, whether it's AOCs, working to delist these areas of concerns, whether it's habitat restoration, there are true success stories and there are true economic benefits that we've been able to see over the past 3-4 years of the program. And as a policy person, data always helps, and we're seeing more and more data come out saying what this program does. We know the data on infrastructure spending as it relates to the water programs. So that's also more of a national program. But data always helps. But really, I think just continuing to talk to your representatives to let them know this is important.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go
Thank you.
in the front here. 1, 2, 3. We're going to get to all three of you. So go ahead, please.
Hi, panelists. My name is Dorcas Johnson. I'm from Case Western at Weatherhead as a youth development and resiliency theory professional. I heard Emma speak of the 804 voters in Ohio, and I'd like to ask you guys, what about the youth surveys that might be out there? The only two agencies that I actually saw when I went around this morning was the Great Lakes Alliance and Glenn Odenbrett with GLSEN. They are our future voters, and they want to enjoy the Great Lakes. Are there any surveys out there for our kids that are using some of the wetlands, the cleaned up beaches and things that we could access, or is there some hope that we can reach something like that, because they are the future of continuing this funding that we're steadily losing?
I don't know offhand of anything of folks under 18. It's much more difficult to do public opinion research among younger folks because you run into issues of parental permission and stuff like that. So telephone surveys usually are 18 and up. or most of what you do, what you see online surveys as well. You know, we do see often in environmental issues when we're looking at young adults, the 18 to 29, that these issues, that they take progressive positions on these issues, that they see the importance of having cleaner energy and protecting our air from pollution and our water from pollution. And so it's something that, you know, your instinct that younger folks would be interested in these is often borne out by the data, although there's not, I'm sorry, I can't tell you much offhand about anybody.
Let's
younger
hope
than
that there's
18.
an opportunity there for us to reach out to them as they become higher accommodations, go to schools, go to jobs for infrastructure and things like that. Just keep it in the back of your mind.
Good, thank you. In the back.
Thank you. Marnie Hello. Marnie Urso with Audubon, Ohio. And Chad, you kind of stole my question, but I directly just wanted to say thank you through you, Jonathan, for Senator Brown standing up for not only the GRI, but other issues that directly are impacting the lake, such as his support for mercury rules. As a mother raising her family right here on the shores of Lake Erie, that really means a lot to me. Also supporting carbon emission rules that since climate change is such a big stressor for our Great Lakes and especially Lake Erie. So I guess I just wanted to emphasize our role in sort of supporting that, and you know, what efforts can we take to embolden Senator Brown, other senators to stand up for this on, you know, EPA standards in that sort of battle that is a continuing fight in Congress. Thank you.
Sure. Well, you let me off easy. I thought you were going to ask me about the alternative minimum tax, so thanks for that. You know, I think it's, you know, hearing from constituents, and all congressmen and senators hear from their constituents all the time, and the internet's been a great tool for that, and phones, obviously. I think the switchboards are always packed, and we do still have a switchboard in the Capitol. You know, I think just continuing to raise awareness to issues, and I think we see that. You know, I read the Plain Dealer and the Blade every day, and you'll see really great nature pieces in both papers about the great birding and fishing going on up here and the great outdoor resources. And I think the greater awareness people in Congress have about this, they realize that these really are issues and topics that people really value, and I think some of the survey really kind of showed that. And I really think it's just awareness, and I think it's you know, letting your folks know about whether it's GLRI or whether it's any number of other issues that are important to the community. Just let them know, because I think, you know, Senator Brown has any indication, and I think other officers are like this. We very much pay attention, and you know, we're there to serve the constituents. And that's what we do, you know, whether it's answering letters or phone calls, it very much matters to hear from people. And so, and certainly we do appreciate it. You know, I think it's good to know what people are thinking about and are seeing on the ground.
Good. Right here in the front.
Thank you. My name's Chris Therio, and I'm here as a board member of the Stewardship Network, which is a capacity building organization based in Ann Arbor. And I've got two simple questions and just one comment. Emma, the woman who remarked on phraseology, when I listened to your survey questions, I may have missed it, but what I kept hearing was environmental as different than conservation. And I know polling is an art unto its own, and the presentation of the words determines the outcome. And so I'm curious if you had that, if you focus group different words. The second point, Paul, the comments on outcomes and economic studies and white papers. I wonder if there's, I don't know if it's possible, but efficiency studies on grant delivery. This is public funding going out, or is that just too in the weeds? And related to that, this is sort of a perverse sort of anecdotal observation that, or sort of say it's counterintuitive. Bipartisan support is actually an anathema in some regards to our current Washington climate. In other words, I've talked about issues that are bipartisan, just sweet spot bipartisan, and been told by people on the inside of the Beltway that those don't even want to come up. In other words, so that's just a general comment, really, nothing more than that. But back to those 2 points, I'd appreciate any comment. Thanks.
Yep. So you raise a great point about the language that we use, and I think one of the earlier questioners did as well. So I want to address both at once. One is I don't think the word environment appeared in the survey questions at all. That was me talking in my language. So you'll have the actual wording of the questions is on the PowerPoint, and you can look at them. They do mean different things to people, environment and conservation. And I think you'll see it's one of the areas where you'll see a different sort of partisan breakdown depending on what you're talking about. Conservation is a word that crosses some lines that environment may have a harder time with. We talked about protect versus restore versus some other ways to talk about it. We did settle on restoration as a way to describe this after listening to people talk for a while. Protect is a good word as well, and it reflects how people see the condition of the Great Lakes right now, which is, and both protect and restore work this way to some extent. They see the Great Lakes as vulnerable, but in okay health. So they recognize that progress has been made since the 60s, before we had some of the protections that we've passed. But know that the lakes are not immune from threats, and that there are many things that come up that can damage them. And so the word protect kind of reflects, kind of hits at where people come. And restore works as well, because it talks about building up to bring back to an even better condition than they are right now. And I know you didn't direct this to me, but I just wanted to answer the question about efficiency studies from a message perspective a little bit, which is that data can be really important, as he said here, when we're talking about talking with members of Congress. When you're talking to the public, nothing can replace an anecdote. It's hard to remember numbers. It's really easy to remember a story. I think you all probably remember the story about the woman burned by McDonald's coffee that is still used as a call for tort reform. And so a story that you can tell about something that really made a difference in your community that the Restoration Initiative did is going to be far more powerful when you're talking to voters than talking about studies showing the economic impact of the changes.
All right, and efficiency of giving or of grant making. There's a trick here. Am I doing it before or am I doing it after? Because to correctly, I'm assuming that you're thinking about this from the perspective of how to direct grants. And so I need a little clarification.
Curiosity, I bumped this woman's knee, but really the question is grants, grant proposal, RFPs, organizations that deliver it. How do you measure 100,000 goes out? Could it have been done with 50,000? Could it have been done with 75? And speed. And I've been involved in different iterations of my career with grants, and so I just wondered if people ask about that, or that can be demonstrated, or if it's an impossibility, to say, yep, that one was done well.
Time for a brief answer, but we do need to.
Well, and the brief answer is yes, people do study it. Yes, they're able to find some answers, and that's an edge of the literature that I haven't read, so I can't tell you what those answers are. But if you email me, I can send you the citations.
Great. Well, let's give a round of applause to our panelists. They traveled, some of them quite a distance to be here with us, and I know I enjoyed each of the presentations.